Hoplite. Okay. Well, the sorting situation wasn't as painful as I feared it would be. Although I think the 2-to-1 ratio that I assumed was not entirely correct. Uh-oh, I'm gonna check my camera because I just touched it. Alrighty. That should work. Well, what do we say? It's a solid entry into the Great Battles of History. Follows up on the same, the chit pull mechanism that Chariots of Fire used. But it may well be my least favorite of the series that I've played so far. And that's not the fault of the designers. That's the fault of Hoplite combat. There are a whole bunch of scenarios. What do they give us here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 scenarios. And towards the end, I don't know, maybe the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 scenarios or so were Greek versus Greek scenarios where all you have is hoplite forces. You don't have a lot of maneuverability with hoplites. They clash together. There's neat aspects to how they kind of rub together and make themselves happy. But it gets tiresome after a few of those scenarios. And having them all backloaded like that probably tainted my view a little bit. The much more interesting scenarios are the earlier ones. The Persian scenarios, they can do some interesting things that you can't do with the hoplites. Let's see, Tagara's hoplites. Mikale is the last of the... Yeah, so you're looking at 1, 2, 4 of those scenarios are non-hoplite versus hoplite armies, I guess. If I've got this right. And it has the biggest damn scenario in Great Battles of History yet, which was very cool to see something that big done on GBOH. Taxing, but not, not out of, not an unreasonable length or size, actually. This isn't the kind of monster that you have to set up, like TSS is, and play for months at a time. It's big for Great Battles of History battle, but the battles in this set are fast. So many of them, they can be over in a couple of turns, less than a half hour, even though they're rated at 2 to 3 hours. That's really on the long side, or assuming that you have to do a lot of rules lookups. Like most of Great Battles of History, the rules are not the most well organized in the world, which is kind of strange. You would think the Mark Herman influence on that would probably temper the situation a little bit. They tend to be pretty well nailed down, though, which is one side of Herman that's always something you can trust and count on. You come with a lot of crap in here, a whole bunch of maps. I'm not going to count them all. There's people who do unboxing videos. Watch their stuff. Player aids for each player. Give you all the combat charts and everything else you need. Tons and tons of counters for the different nationalities. Probably more than you need. You probably could have gotten away with some kind of generic counters, but it's kind of neat because here you have the color coding and everything, and it all works well with it. The scenario book is humongous, 50 pages, to handle all those scenarios, to give you not just the scenarios, but to give you the simple Great Battles of History rules in here. And I've sort of gone into a compendium of what you get instead of worrying terribly about what I was saying, which is the why it's not that interesting. And that's the simple fact that the hoplites aren't going to be doing a lot of tactical maneuvering. The last few scenarios, you get some hints about Theban innovations, and they kind of maybe throw some neat ideas in there, like attacking an echelon or something, or their special units. But for the most part, if you want to be using tactics, you're stuck in those first few scenarios where the Persians are involved, because they can use tricky stuff like tactics. The hoplites, their main thing is that they're fucking invulnerable. I mean, at least the good quality ones, they just march up, smash into something, and just stand there shoving against it for, however long it takes, and eventually one or the other unit will break if it's two hoplite units hitting each other. And that seems to be an accurate depiction from what, the historical information and a certain degree of analysis as well reflect. So it's not like you're getting a fantastic or fantasy view of hoplites. You're getting something that really kind of gives you a great deal of detail on it. There's one gripe I have about the historical accuracy of the feel of the game, as it were. And that is motivated by the victory conditions and the positioning and whatever. Generally, and yes, there was one scenario that's badly broken by the rules, but there's errata for that. I griped my ass off about it, and then somebody said, well, yeah, there was a discussion about this. Yeah. The thing that worries me is that if you set two hoplite lines facing each other, whoever moves first gets into the zone of the other one, so the other one can slam into you. And there's an advantage to being the first one to attack. And there's nothing really in the system that motivates one player or the other to attack. That leaves it to, okay, well, I should stand back and just not do anything. And you kind of feel like both players should just be sitting there and refusing to fight. And that's obviously not what happened, and it's not reasonable in terms of the motivation of the armies, etc. If they just stood there glaring at each other, I would guess that their morale would drop. And that gives me a hint towards how to fix it. If your hoplites don't move, and you're not in a specific scenario where you're intended to be the defensive player, you lose a point of route points. It seems to me, or some larger amount of points. It seems to me a solution to get both players moving towards each other, get them to get that momentum up, because otherwise, they're just not, if they're playing ultra competitively, they're probably not going to want to actually attack. And I keep trying to put these away, but I want to look at the systems in particular. Now, one of the things that people might say, you're a Great Battles of History fan, you might not like the chit pull dynamic. No, that's not true. That did not hurt at all. In fact, I'm pretty ambivalent between the two. The more traditional Great Battles of History games had a much more complex, at least mentally and mechanically, not in terms of what it allowed you to do necessarily, system of determining which unit went first. The two systems are not equivalent. You can't just transplant one into another game. You couldn't just make a chit pull game out of SPQR and expect to see it play out exactly the same. But in terms of the overall results, it's probably pretty close. There's a little bit less room for maybe manipulation with the chit pull, because you only have one momentum chit, which allows you to do a continuation type action, or the equivalent of that. And you only have one trump event to allow you to break in. So there's less opportunities for kind of managing the randomness in a strategic sort of way, in the sense that you've got some kind of plan to try to force the other guy to use his trumps or something like that. You're not going to have any of that shit, but I don't terribly view that as all that interesting, and I certainly don't view it as any more historically accurate than pulling them out of a chit cup. You know, it might be more interesting to some very competitive players, though, to play the non-chit pull games of this. It's probably a wash in terms of solitaire suitability, although the less decisions makes the chit pull a little easier. It's probably a little less interesting, but more fluid, simpler to play. What the hell? Okay. What do we got that we want to actually talk about here? Because, you know, I've covered great battles of history. You can look at Marco's coverage of this for a good intro to Hoplite and or great battles of history. I think this may not be where he started, but it's I think he did actually. But he's more likely to give you an intro to the whole system on this. This is not one I would suggest as a starter, though, to tell you the truth. If you want one that's light with chip pull and that is more fun, my favorite in this series is Chariots of Fire so far. I love the sweeping maneuvers the Chariots do. This one, there's some intricate decisions that you make with the Persians on how to deploy and how to cope with those really super powerful units, and how you can kind of force them into your command and make them take missile casualties and stuff like that. How you can use your crappier troops and your lighter troops to really harass the shit out of these heavy hoplite units. And that's kind of interesting, but it only goes so far. It doesn't give you that pictorial imagery of the sweeps of the chariots. You have chariots in some of the scenarios, and they can kind of do it. They're nowhere near as effective in this. It also doesn't give you the richness of, say, SPQR, which is probably the one I'm most familiar with overall, or was. I've played the most. The Roman army is so tactically flexible that if you put two Roman armies against each other, you both have a lot of options. And there are a lot of different types of armies you get to face. You get to face the successors to the hoplites, the Alexandrian phalanxes, and you know, Carthage uses that tactical system. So do the successor states, which are included in some of the modules and stuff that's available for SPQR. And then you have the barbarians, who have a totally different style of fighting and everything. So you have a richer span of tactical opportunities in the box there. In this, you really don't. You have the Persian army system and you have the Greek army system. And then you have what permutations you can get out of that, you know. And the Persian army system is such a hodgepodge that you get a lot in any battle with a Persian army there, but it tends to not be it tends to be little sections that each fight differently, which is neat, but it's not like having a homogeneous phalanx army available or whatever to face the Romans system. So I found it a little less interesting there. I'm not sure how the SPQR derivatives, things like Caesar and Cataphract, well, yeah, Cataphract probably is a little different because you're going to start having, I think, the heavy cav taking a heavier role in the game there. I'm not quite sure how Conquest of Gaul. I'm not sure how much more how interesting those are going to be either compared to SPQR. SPQR is really a particularly rich set of scenarios available to you. Chariots of Fire gives you a less rich set of scenarios, but a lot of different flavors to them. This gives you a couple of big different flavors, and it gives you a lot of repetition within them, but kind of like when I did Flying Colors, it was starting to outlast its welcome, except that the scenarios are so nice and quick. You know, it's there aren't many that are the size of the big Flying Colors scenarios or whatever. the ones that there are well worth it because what is it? My memory dies immediately. Plataea is just so huge, and there's so many disparate elements in that Persian army. And the Greek army is a little different. You have options with the Greeks too in terms of deployment. It's just a tremendous experience, and it's well playable. You could play that probably in one long sitting or maybe two. It's always hard for me to tell. But most of them are really nice little short scenarios that didn't last too long each, so they kind of didn't annoy as much as that many longer scenarios would. And you've got a nice mix of different lengths, etc. Some moderate length ones as well for GBOH at least. There were some significant differences. Let me see the designer's notes and see if I have anything I want to find. Designer's notes. I seem to remember there were some. But there were some about the different concepts in this. I mean, they stripped away a lot of some of the more fiddly aspects of earlier GBOH games, but they didn't take everything out of it. You still have to record, your hits against all your units and which units have moved in a turn and stuff like that. It all has to be marked down in some way or another. And that's going to be a continuous issue. What's interesting is you don't flip your moved counters. Flipped counters for this system are out of command units, which means you have a lot less fiddling with that, and you can just throw a moved counter down for a bunch of units and say, yeah, they all moved, I know that, where it has an effect. Your cav is so weak in this, and that's kind of interesting to play around with, to try to figure out how you can make the cav work here. Obviously, the big hoplite units are going to be tough to maneuver, just like the phalanxes in the later systems. The harassment and dispersal tactics. This is fairly new. I think this showed up in Chariots of Fire, and there's a few other techniques in it that have made skirmishers more valuable, where they can kind of do more what they're supposed to do, and they don't cost you as much. Skirmishers in the old SPQR, at least, I don't know about the newer edition, had this horrible tendency to really not serve their purpose well. What you wanted to do was get them out behind your lines so that they could hunt down enemy routing units and finish them off. They might do that historically, but they were deployed in front of the army always, and they're just a pain in the ass in the other system. They're not completely free of that here. You still don't really want them in front of your armies, but to tell you the truth, from the historical description, it doesn't look like the hoplites put them out in front as much. So they tended to use them more to screen the flanks of the line and to give it a little additional flexibility and defense on those sides so that they wouldn't completely fall apart. And like I said, cav is very weak. Even your heavy cav isn't really able to face up against the hoplite units. They have to form up into a wedge. They don't have stirrups, man. And try to use the weight of that wedge to break into something, and still they have to try to go for a flank or a rear attack to do that. Anything else exciting here that? I mean, the most exciting thing really is how resilient those hoplite phalanxes are. There's square formation, but you usually don't have to bother with it. There's so little cav in the game, and it's so ineffective that it seems questionable to be stuck in a square ever. Oh, yeah, there's the neat idea of the hoplite momentum as well, where they go, once you start them moving, they just keep moving towards the enemy for their first, before they've made contact. And you kind of roll a die to see how fast they go. And in general, you want them to go normal speed at a trot. And the Spartan units are disciplined enough they can do that. You don't have to roll for them. But there's kind of a mixed effect here. The worst you can get is probably, well, it depends on your situation. You could get a walk result, which means you're just gonna your hoplites are gonna be going too slowly, or you could get a run result, which means they're gonna be going nice and fast, one faster than they should, and they're gonna take cohesion hits as they're charging towards the enemy. But they get a bonus when they actually strike the enemy, and that bonus may, if you do the attack quickly enough, close enough to the enemy, it's probably worth the extra hit. But yeah, their resilience is just amazing against each other, against anything. At least the big phalanx units. The regular hoplites don't have that advantage. Anyway, like I said, it's a solid entry into the GBOH. Even if it's my least favorite of the series, it still ranks me as 7 after having played through too many hoplite versus hoplite scenarios, probably. I was getting more pleasure, I think, out of the Persian scenarios. But it's just not a topic. It's a topic that, grabs the imagination, and you immediately start thinking, wow, this is some of the greatest battles from our antiquity, some of the ones that are most glorious and well known, things like Marathon. Well, yeah, except they're hoplites, and when you look at the reality of hoplites, they don't provide you with the most interesting tactical choices. That usually isn't too big a deal for me. For example, I like American Civil War, and I don't think that provides you with all that many interesting tactical choices. But yeah, these units are not. There aren't a lot of different neat things you can do with them. They're slow. They like to go forward. They like to kind of drift to the right if you try to push them too hard. The options that you have, usually it's pretty clear what you want to do, and it's just a matter of optimizing how much damage you're likely to do. You can kind of crunch the numbers and come up with the odds of what you're going to do. And you're not going to trick the enemy. You're not, you're not going to be able to pull off some clever maneuver that puts you usually into a really nice position. Although, in the last couple of scenarios where you have that super huge Theban unit, that adds some interesting facets to the game. I was kind of enjoying what that did to the game. That's not a real hoplite. That's just so dense and so big that it kind of carries the hoplites before it. They still have their resilience, and you might not break them, but you're more likely to break them than not. Also, then there's the idea that if there's some hoplite units that don't have terribly good tactical quality, and those aren't very resilient, because the thing that makes the hoplite so resilient is when they break in melee combat, they get a chance to roll and see, yeah, I didn't really break. I'm still here. Well, if they don't have a very good chance of succeeding at that, and I mean the worst hoplites I think for the phalanxes have a 5, so you're still talking better than 50% chance of making that save, though there are modifiers to it. If you take a lot of damage, you're going to fail that save. But the weaker ones melt away not too much more slowly than regular units do. But the really high quality hoplite phalanxes are just invulnerable, and that's neat too. But it's not as engaging as some of the other games in the series, especially Chariots of Fire, which just rocks. And it's so sad because I don't know how Maharaja and Devil's Horseman play out. They both kind of intrigue me as to being very fluid and interesting playing too, probably. And it's kind of funny to me because these ones that are kind of out on the fringes seem to be some of the more interesting ones, but not to sell very well. I know Samurai took a while to sell out, and that's the one that sold me on the whole system. I was like, well, I'm all in on this. Anyway, it's still pretty damn good. I mean, the worst of the great battles of history is still a pretty good game. And certainly if you're interested in the Greek period, who the hell isn't? You want this, but if you're interested in great battles of history in particular and you want to find one to play, wow, 15 different volumes. Jeez. I think I have them all too, actually. I think so. Not all the expansions yet, but yeah, it's not a bad start. I just think that I could see some people walking away saying, well, that was dull. It was kind of neat to watch, but I didn't have a lot of tactical decisions at all in it. The other ones give you richer tactical decisions, richer ability to really influence the play. So this might not be the best place to get an introduction to it, unless you are so gung-ho about hoplites that, because to tell you the truth, topic trumps everything else. And, if you're more interested in hoplites than you are in Roman battles or, sad to say, chariots, how can you not be interested in chariots, man? How do those things work? What? You gotta see it. And, okay, the one argument against Chariots of Fire that really kind of is more believable to me is we're not sure how they work, but we got some pretty good theories, and when you get a good game that comes out of those theories, how can you resist? It's like elephants. You gotta... All right. I'll set it up.